afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to all of you to St Hugh's. My name is Eilish Angelini, and I have the huge privilege of being the principal of St Hugh's College. I'm delighted it's such a happy occasion because we're here to celebrate the life of Gwyneth Bebb and the achievement of those pioneering women in law and indeed elsewhere in public life that has brought us on somewhat from where we were in 1908. But I'm delighted to see all here in this fabulous afternoon with the background of happy laughter from the graduation. I opened the windows in order that you would have more air, but if it's too noisy, someone can just close it over, or in fact, if it's drafty, please do that as well. I'm just delighted also to warmly welcome the family of Gwyneth Bebb here. It's just wonderful to have you here, and hopefully you'll be hearing much more about Gwyneth from Professor Pasetta and others at a later stage. But as many of you will know, Gwyneth Bebb is an alumna of this college. We're enormously proud of what she achieved in her challenge to the status quo, the presumption that a woman was not a person in terms of the Act which allowed persons to qualify as a solicitor. And indeed, although that action itself was not successful, her continuing efforts thereafter did bring about success, and I'll leave it to Senya to tell you about that. But safe to say that we have been the beneficiaries of a number of very important alumni, and Veronica will be introducing this very distinguished panel that is part of it. But I'm particularly delighted to see our alumna, the Right Honourable Nicky Morgan, returning to college as well here. So again, welcome back and welcome home to your college again. And indeed, there have been many other very distinguished women and lawyers here. We have Barbara Castle, we have current Prime Minister Theresa May, we have a number of women who have in public life and at the very beginning made great sacrifices for the rights of women, including Emily Wilding Davidson, who of course you'll know is the woman who threw herself in front of the King's horse at the Derby, and Clara Morden, who made this whole college possible in terms of the finance that she provided for it, and another great suffragette at that stage. So much to celebrate, but much still to be done. And therefore, I simply want to welcome you here in this wonderful afternoon. I am also a lawyer, and I don't practice as much as I used to, but I'm a Scottish lawyer, you'll have gathered that. The Glaswegian accent is difficult to change, even in the leafy spires of Oxford. But there is a rebuttable presumption, I have to say, when I go into a shop here and speak, that I'm a shoplifter. And I've been trying to challenge that ever since. My career is one which in many ways perhaps reflects the experience of many lawyers who are the first at something. I was the first woman in 500 years to be appointed the Solicitor General for Scotland, and thereafter the Lord Advocate of Scotland, a law officer post similar to the Attorney General. And it was interesting that the history of that was one which was accompanied by expressions of doubt as to whether or not basically this would be Lord Advocate Light, L-I-T-E, as is the case, because I wasn't, as my predecessors had invariably been, very large, tall men, and somewhat diminutive. But the questions posed by journalists when I came in, my entry into these roles coincided with some terrible acts of terrorism, and therefore we were putting up bomb curtains on the windows, but asked if I was responsible for the new net curtains that had been erected, and the pink walls of the office. So that was the focus of interest at that stage. But they weren't quite so brazen as those our predecessors suffered. I do remember this article that Amanda Ingram, our archivist, who's responsible for the lovely exhibition you see at the back, Nora and our librarian and Amanda are with us today, but she provided me with a copy of this, which I think will at least amuse and also appall you at the same time. It came from the Evening Standard in 1913, and the headline was "Why Women Would Be Failures at Law by a Solicitor. How courageous is that?" And the article, I'm not reading it all, but just a little excerpt will give you a flavour of what it was about. "Why all this opposition on the part of my brothers-in-law to the admission of women as solicitors? It is quite the most glaring example of defeatism since the start of the war. Women have done amazing things during the last 4 years. There are apparently no bounds to their all-conquering genius, and nothing which they have attempted at which they have not made good. Let them try their hand at the law, but it will most certainly prove their one failure. The legal mind is the one purely masculine asset. There have been bearded women, but no woman has ever had a legal mind or ever will have one. The chief characteristic of a legal mind is absolute impartiality, the gift of being able to see both sides of a question. Woman's outstanding characteristic and charm is her wholehearted enthusiasm. It is this that makes her such a success in all that she has hitherto attempted, and it is this that will make her a hopeless failure as a lawyer. For no good lawyer is ever enthusiastic. So with that, I will leave it to Veronica Lowe. I'm sure many of you will be speechless to take the day forward. Thank you very much indeed. We're a bit cosily situated.
Before I introduce our distinguished speakers and panellists, I would simply urge attenders at the end of the session if they would like to look at the biographies of our speakers and panellists, which will be shown on the screen over there. The reason why I say that is that if I started to list all the achievements of our distinguished guests here, there wouldn't be any time for any speeches or any questions, but they are a truly outstanding bunch of, dare I say it, women. First of all, we have as speaker Professor Senya Pasita. She's actually speaking on Gwyneth Bebb herself. Senya is a tutorial fellow here at St Hugh's and is co-director of Women in the Humanities in the University, Professor of Modern History specialising in modern Irish history, and she's been the university's lead on the celebration of women's suffrage. Indeed, she's curated an absolutely fascinating exhibition at the Western Library called From Sappho to Suffrage. And I would urge, it's still going on, and I would urge people to go and take a look, including at the board game. Yes. There is a suffrage board game, very interesting. The next speaker is Jane Robinson, who is a senior associate at Somerville. Rather interestingly, she started her career in the antiquarian book trade and made a change to being a writer. She's written 10 books on women's search for individuality, education and achievement, with intriguing titles such as Pandora's Daughters, Wayward Women, possibly quite a few here today, and Force to be Reckoned with, and I think there are quite a few of those here today. Certainly, I think Jane may have been inspired by a clergyman's comment that she quotes in her book, Blue Stockings, which many of you will have read. Inferior to us, God made you, and our inferiors to the end of time, will you remain? Which brings me very neatly to Dr. Sheila Cameron, the end there, or I should say the Right Worshipful Dr. Sheila Cameron, CBE QC DBL. The clergyman quoted by Jane in Blue Stockings would probably have absolute apoplexy because Sheila, after a very interesting career, actually became the most senior lawyer in the Church of England as the Dean of the Arches, the judge who presides over the appeal court of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and also in the equivalent position for the Archbishop of York. She was called to the bar in 1957 and took silk in 1983. And if she doesn't mind me saying so, her very interesting biography, which you will see on the screen at the end, actually illustrates some of the prejudice and vicissitudes which female lawyers actually met at that time. Next we have Dame Janet Gamer, QC Honorary, just there from Sheila. Janet has created, I think, the most polymathic career, and I hope I've not just invented that adjective. She is the outstanding female employment lawyer of our time. She was the first woman to become senior partner of a leading solicitors firm in the City of London. She became the Commissioner for Public Appointments, a Civil Service Commissioner, and is a non-executive member of the supervisory body for the administration of the House of Commons, and the chair of the House of Commons Estimate and Audit Committee on Financial Responsibility. Well, that's quite some responsibility there. And as I say, truly polymathic. We also have Carolyn Kirby, OBE. Next one, I did all these in alphabetical order, so I'll say next one along. Carolyn was the 158th president of the Law Society. Okay, 158th, well, but the first female president of the Law Society in 2002. And a question I suppose I should pose to Carolyn is, why did it take you so long? There have been male presidents of the Law Society since, I think, the 1840s. So Carolyn had that distinction of being the first female president. But at least I suppose it was after the millennium term, so certainly I think there have been 5 since. And we're honoured to have the 174th president of the Law Society, Christina Blacklaws, here with us today. But Carolyn became a solicitor in 1979, so more or less about the same time as me. And she's been president of the Mental Health Review Tribunal for Wales since 1999. Interestingly, as we heard about Sheila's career, Carolyn is a judge of the Court of the Church of Wales. So, 2 ecclesiastical lawyers. But also, she spent many years supporting charities for vulnerable people, for cancer victims, for those who are dispossessed. And it's very interesting that in 2016 she actually wrote something that I would call a treatise on, it's called Self-Love for Beginners. And as she points out at the start, it's not to do with marijuana or anything like that. But if you are acting as a mentor, one of the ways that you can improve your mentoring, but also ensure that your own mental health is sound, is by befriending and advising yourself. And I think that's very good advice. And of course we have the Right Honourable Nicky Morgan, who's been the MP for Loughborough since 2010, who, like Sheila Cameron, is also an alumna of the college. As you will know, formerly Secretary of State for Education and Minister for Women and Equalities, Financial and Economic Secretary to the Treasury, and now, as I'm sure everybody knows, Chair of the all-powerful Treasury Select Committee, and all power to your elbow, Nicky. But to be fair, I would also say that one of your major interests is character development in education, and also optimism in politics. More power to that elbow as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. Please don't look at my biography; it's not very interesting when it turns up on the board. I must confess that before I spoke to Veronica and Gianetta about Gwyneth Bebb, I really knew very little about her. I had come across her name in some published works, and more often in some of the primary sources I use in my own research, particularly women's suffrage journals, that kind of thing. So it's been wonderful to get to know her a little more through writing this talk, not only because of her clearly vital role in opening the legal profession to women, but also because of her stellar career at St Hugh's. And this centenary this year of women's suffrage has been really good for the college, I think. We've started to talk a lot more about the women who excelled in the college, and not only women who excelled, but all the women who came through in this period. And the 1919 centenary as well, I think, again, will give us a chance to honour our pathbreakers like Gwyneth Bebb, and I'm really delighted that we can do this. Their efforts, I think we always have to remember, made the lives that so many of us in this room take for granted possible. So a very short overview of her life from a historian's perspective. She was born at Brasenose House in Oxford in 1889, next door to the All Saints Church, which I think is now the library of Lincoln College. She was... Sorry. Not working? Anyway, most of these pictures are taken from the exhibition, so you'll be able to see them there as well. Well, it's a lovely photograph, so we can focus on that. There she is. No, she's gone. It's okay. She's gone again. There she is, yes. That's a picture of her with her mother and another picture of her when she was about 2 in Oxford. She was born into a family which was steeped in education and learning, though I heard this morning from one of her relatives that rumour has it that her mother was not altogether keen on her going into higher education. Was it? She said when Gwyneth Bebb said to her mother that she was interested in studying law, her mother said, well, you could marry a lawyer in that case. And then she did both. She studied law and she married a lawyer, so there. Her father was the Reverend Dr. Llewellyn John Montfort Bebb, who was a fellow of Brasenose, which is why she was born there, and he was later vice principal of the college. Her mother was the daughter of a surgeon. She was one of 6 children. The family moved from Oxford when her father took up a post at St David's College at Lampeter in 1898. Before that, this is entirely almost irrelevant to her life. The family had lived in 96 Banbury Road, which is just down the road from St Hugh's. I think we should buy that house. It's the next step.
Someone will give it to us.
Right, that's the family at Lampeter. She was sent to St Mary's College in Paddington, which was then in Paddington in London, where she did her school certificate. She was only there from 1906 to 1908, but she evidently made such an impression on the school that after her death, a stained glass memorial window was commissioned and paid for by subscription by her family and friends in honour of a truly brilliant and clearly well-loved former pupil. In 1908, she came to St Hugh's, which was then St Hugh's Hall, to read law. Now, by all accounts, and I've done quite a lot of research into St Hugh's life in the period, college life was fun, enjoyable, but it was also politically charged for women like Bebb, because she came to Oxford when the women's suffrage movement was at its height. And Oxford and St Hugh's itself were both hotbeds of suffrage activism. We don't know, and I don't know, I haven't found a record of this, if she was herself very involved in the suffrage movement. But even if she wasn't, there's no doubt that its central arguments about women's equality provided a crucial background to her intellectual and political development as a young woman. Any notice board that she walked past in her college house would have had posters, for example, relating to women's suffrage. This is a picture of her studying, possibly in Oxford, apparently. The BA Honours Jurisprudence was open to women in Oxford in 1890. Women generally had the same instruction and exams as men, but of course were not permitted to take their degrees until 1920. Gwyneth Bebb was the 7th woman to study law in Oxford. At the time, when she studied at St Hugh, there were only 2 women here who were studying law. The other one, Marion Crick, didn't finish her degree, which meant that for the majority of her time here in Oxford, Gwyneth Bebb was the only woman amongst about 400 law students. So she was conspicuous, I think we can say. And brave, I would have thought. In 1911, she passed her finals with first-class honours, the first woman to have done so. Her choice of law as a subject I find intriguing. It was popular at the time as a subject, but it was clearly a risky choice for a woman who at the time could not practice and so could not use her education in her career. And women who came to Oxford in this period did want careers, we know that. Most of them tended to study subjects like English, which was the most popular, and it was the most popular because it was the most useful for women who wanted to become teachers. So it's unlikely that she chose the subject because she imagined her family could support her while she was here and after she left, because they probably couldn't have. I think she chose law because she was intellectually interested in it and as a subject, and also probably because she believed that a career in the law was in fact not impossible, despite the hostile position of the legal profession of both branches. Women and their allies had been attempting to break down barriers in the legal profession since at least the 1870s. Most other professions were open to women by the time she came up to St Hugh's. So I suspect that she believed that in her own time that law might go the same way. In 1912, a private member's bill to admit women into the solicitor's profession was introduced. Both branches of the law were utterly unenthusiastic, went nowhere, and the decision was then taken to pursue a route through the courts, and it is, of course, in this context that Gwyneth Bebb became something of a household name. She and 3 other women submitted applications to the Law Society seeking permission to sit for its exams and enclosing the required fee, which was very polite of them. All these applications and their money were returned to the women. The 4 of them brought separate actions after that against the Law Society, challenging the idea, as Eilish said, that women were not persons within the meaning of the Solicitors Act of 1843. I'm sorry to say that the passage that you read, Eilish, is just so familiar to any of us who work in this period. We're kind of shocked when we get the alternative view. Now, quite why these 4 women, who are Gwyneth Bebb, Karen Costello, Maud Ingram and Lucy Nettlefold, were chosen is unclear to me anyway. They each had distinguished academic records, 2 from Cambridge, 2 from Oxford. Bebb's was the most distinguished. But I suspect they were probably, partly at least, chosen to counteract the image of violent, unlawful, unwomanly, criminal feminism, which was then at its height in the militant suffrage movement. I'm not saying that I thought they were criminal and unwomanly. That's certainly one of the ways that they were perceived in the period. The litigants, they didn't expect to win in 1912 when they took their cases, but they, of course, wanted publicity, and they knew they'd get publicity. And they had to be careful, I think, about the kind of publicity that they attracted, remembering that the last woman who had taken a very public case in order to enter the profession was Christabel Pankhurst in 1904, who was herself a law graduate. I'm sure this was in their minds when they chose these very respectable women. Bebb's action was taken as the test, and so she gave her name to the celebrated case. It was heard and lost before a hostile judge, and the decision was upheld then in the Court of Appeal. But the campaign continued during the war years via bills, committees, pressure groups, not least because of the commitment of Bebb and the other 3 litigants to publicising it. And this is made very clear in records kept by another of the litigants, Lucy Nettlefold, which show that she remained committed and active in the cause until well beyond 1912. In 1918, the Sex Disqualification of Women Bill reached its 3rd reading, but was overtaken by the soon-to-be successful Sex Disqualification Removal Act, which Jane will be speaking about very soon. Bebb herself enjoyed a successful career, despite her case being unsuccessful, and she always worked, whether she was married or not. She went straight into a job after St Hugh's in the Board of Trade. In 1917, during the war, she took a job in the News Service for Women as a commissioner before moving on to a post in the Ministry of Food. She remained in that ministry until 1920 when she was awarded the OBE in recognition of her work there. Oh, and in 1917 she found the time to marry as well. That's her husband, the happy couple. So in 1917 she married Thomas Weldon Thompson, a lawyer. In 1919 their daughter, Alice Diana, was born, and that's a lovely picture of the 2 of them, which is a picture that often comes up. In January of the same year, Bebb applied for entry to Lincoln's Inn and was refused. After the Sex Disqualification Act received royal assent on Christmas Eve in 1919, which was the day after the birth of her daughter, she applied to Lincoln's Inn. This time she was accepted on the 29th of December. First woman barrister, except she wasn't, as we'll see. Another highlight came in 1920 when she was finally able to graduate, when Oxford formally and finally admitted women to full membership of the university. And I've seen the records of the first women who graduated, and most of them are much older, in fact, than Gwyneth Bebb. Lots of women came back to take their degrees. In 1920, she also dined for the first time at Lincoln's Inn. And she joked with her sister about this in a letter, which I just want to quote from because we're extremely lucky to have from the family some of her personal letters, which bring her to life as an actual person with a sense of humour. I mean, some of the letters that she had with her sister about maternity clothes, I have to say, made me laugh. The idea of them being like ship sails and this kind of thing, I think a lot of us can relate to. But she wrote to her sister, "I was admitted to Lincoln's Inn the day after Diana was born, which might have been complicated, but they let me wait to complete formalities till she was 3 weeks old. And then I crept up to town and dined in hall and kept my first term. We had a great dinner at the House of Commons at the beginning of March, when all the legal nuts turned up, and I had to propose the toast of the bar, to which the Attorney General replied, 'Quite a lark, but very alarming.' I'd say, just after having a baby and everything else. While she studied for the bar exam, she worked at her husband's law firm, and she was fully expected to be the first woman called to the English bar, but it was not to be, as she tragically died after giving birth to a premature daughter, Marion, in 1921, and sadly Marion died too. This is a very, very quick summary of a life, a complicated life, and it's a summary, as you will have no doubt gathered, by a non-lawyer. But my reading of her life as a historian and as a feminist historian is really that the magnitude of the case and the campaign that preceded it have been grossly underplayed in the literature as far as I can see. And this doesn't surprise me as someone who works in related fields. As one scholar has recently argued, this kind of reduction of the role of this, of the magnitude of this, has reduced half a century of campaigning to an episode. This was a long, serious campaign. I think the agency of women like Gwyneth Bebb and the resistance of the profession have been minimised. In some ways, oddly, Bebb appeared to me to be a very private person. And this is perhaps one of the reasons that she's not as well known as she might be. I think she will be, hopefully, in the next couple of years. I found that tracing the details of her co-plaintiffs were much, much easier. They turned up all over the place. But Gwyneth Bebb didn't seem to be a joiner. I managed to trace her membership of the St Hugh's Club while she was a student, but everybody joined that, so that wasn't much. She contributed one book review to Common Cause, which was a leading suffrage journal, and she spoke at one suffrage venue, as far as I can see. But this is quite a modest speaking and writing profile for such an important figure. Of course, not all women who were professionally and politically active in the period were as well known or engaged as the Pankhurst or Millicent Fawcett, but I was surprised not to see more of a trail for her given her public profile as a litigant and my own knowledge of women's activism in the period. But she was working very hard, that's very clear, behind the scenes, making sure that this legislation eventually went through. And I think the evident lack of desire for the limelight means, to me anyway, that her decision to take this case in 1912 is even more striking and reflects her absolute commitment to opening the legal profession to women. And I am very glad to be here today to remember that campaign and to remember her role in it. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's such an honour to be here and to have the opportunity to contribute to what I'm sure will be a fascinating afternoon. Based on work in progress, I'm currently writing a book about the first women in the traditional professions following the 1990 Act that I'm going to talk about now. I will just explain a little bit about the Sex Disqualification (Removal) Act, which, if you'll forgive me, I'll henceforth call the SDRA. But first, I'd like to take you back to a special occasion in the history of British women's rights, which Senya referred to. It was unseasonably cold on the evening of the 8th of March, 1920. As the guests drew up at the Palace of Westminster, dusk was falling and there was already a promise of frost in the air. It had been a busy day in the House of Commons. Its 700-odd members, all men but one, had grappled with the fate of a military mission in Soviet Russia, the employment of ex-servicemen, how children should be provided with medical care at school, and the parlour state of the House's ventilation system. Now business was over and it was time for a long-awaited celebration to begin. Among the first to arrive at the party was Mrs. Ray Strachey, veteran of the women's suffrage campaign and a progressive champion of women in the professions. Not that there were many women in the professions before then. A few score doctors and surgeons, seasoned by war work, but not allowed to study in many teaching hospitals nor to become members of the Royal Colleges of Physicians or Surgeons. Some pretend engineers and architects, whose unfeminine ambition made right-minded people laugh. A handful of unorthodox priestesses, who recalled Johnson's famous quip that a woman preaching is like a dog walking on its hind legs, It's not done well, but you're surprised to find it done at all. There were thousands of women teachers, but until 1944 they were expected to resign upon marriage, which meant their average working life was 3 years. There was only one professor, university professor, at one of those Johnny-come-lately modern universities, no qualified barristers or solicitors at all. Ray Strachey's great friend and suffragist ally Millicent Garrett Fawcett was there, for whom walking into Parliament by invitation remained a novelty. Shifting memories of past violence and despair still stirred the corridors of power, and it seemed strange to be hailed as a heroine by the other guests. The Lord Chancellor, Attorney General, Solicitor General among them, legal nuts, as we now know that they were called by Gwyneth Bebb. It was a splendid evening with speeches and high-flown compliments on all sides. Mrs. Fawcett was in her 73rd year. Most of the other women at the banquet were younger, including Helena Normanton, who went on to become one of the first 2 female KCs, Viscountess Rhondda, a business magnate from Wales, and a young wife called Gwyneth Thompson, née Bebb. Officially, the occasion was to celebrate the passing of the SDRA a few weeks previously and to launch a loan fund for women students hoping to study law, now that the Act had made it possible for them to do so. But in many ways, like today, it was all about Gwyneth. She was asked to propose a toast that evening. In her speech, she promised that if ever she were required to wear a wig in the course of her legal duties, she would try to arrange her hair so that it didn't look too ridiculous. Not for her own sake, mind, but to preserve the dignity of the profession. Hear, hear, chuckled an avuncular Lord Chancellor. Then she repeated a comment made to her by a fellow male trainee. Unless she could drink a pint of ale and a bottle of port at dinner, it was useless to expect to be admitted to any inn of court. No hear, hear this time. An uncomfortable pause was adroitly broken by Gwyneth's admission that she had got away with quaffing ginger beer instead. She was grateful for the welcome she'd been given at Lincoln's Inn, she said, and looked forward with confidence to the future. Perhaps she was naive. Stodgy arguments against women in the professions had been circulating for years, no less popular now than they had ever been, despite the passing of the Act. Gentlemen should never stoop to taking orders from women. It was degrading and flew in the face of nature. Women were unsexed by gentlemen's work, and doctors warned that thinking too much withered the womb. Conversely, their attractiveness distracted men from the business in hand. But Miss Jones, you're beautiful. Some were refused high-caliber posts on the grounds of being too plain. Others explicitly on the grounds of being too plain. Others because they were too pretty. Trumping all these arguments was the perennial claim that women couldn't possibly work in a man's world, as there weren't any ladies' lavatories there. The smoking rooms of professional societies and associations and royal colleges and clubs rumbled with self-righteous discontent at the thought of a petticoat invasion, while senior common rooms in the ancient universities refused to appoint women whose teaching methods might interfere, as they put it, with the proper education of young men. I came across one argument just yesterday when I was doing research, posited by lawyers against women entering the Inns of Court, and that was a very cogent argument. It said, if we have women in the Inns of Court, there won't be enough cheese to go round. As we know, none of this daunted Gwyneth, bolstered by the encouraging clauses of the SDRA stating that a person shall not be disqualified by sex or marriage from the exercise of any public function or from being appointed to or holding any civil or judicial office or post, or from entering or assuming or carrying on any civil profession or vocation. She dutifully ate her regulation dinners at Lincoln's Inn and passed the necessary exams during her first year. The future did indeed look bright, and she was already a shining role model for her companions in the professions. We might consider Gwyneth's story unusual. The popular image of the pioneering career woman is of a loud eccentric whose genius and grim determination set her apart from mere mortals, a modern Boudica riding roughshod over convention to lead a growing army of formidable females to storm the citadels of the establishment and shatter the glass ceiling within. Crystal ceiling, I think, more in the case of the professions. By all accounts, Gwyneth was gentle, quietly humorous, a proud wife and mother, and in the nicest possible way, quite ordinary. Clever, certainly, and charismatic, with a strong sense of vocation, but no doyenne. She was just one of a bustling company of pioneers, arms linked, who were, like you and me, only braver, more intrepid, and with none of the career advantages we now enjoy because of what they did. The SDRA should have been one of the most significant pieces of legislation in modern British history. It signalled at once a political watershed and a social revolution, the point at which women were technically recognised as competent as men. But that technically is important. It was an enabling act rather than an empowering one. It enabled establishments like the bar, like the Royal Colleges of Medicine and Surgery, architecture and engineering bodies to admit women. It enabled women to be admitted to university and to graduate on the same terms as men. It allowed women to be appointed magistrates and to serve as jurors, but there was no requirement to do so, no penalty for not doing so, and the civil service was explicitly excused the terms of the Act. If a convincing argument could be raised against admitting women to membership of a professional body, then that was good enough for now. Architects at Reba argued in the early 1920s that women couldn't possibly be proper architects because everyone knows that ladies can't climb ladders. And even if some women managed to inveigle their way in, the marriage bar still obtained in so many professions, with individual exceptions, that any thought of a long career nurtured through experience was futile. This was in direct contravention of the Act, you would have thought, until you realise that the semantics of a woman not being debarred by marriage can be shifted to mean that just because a woman is married, it doesn't mean that she can't be employed. Not that she must be employed, even though she's married. You might think that's casuistry at its best. I couldn't possibly comment. Even the clause in the SDRA about women jurors was compromised by an amendment that judges had the right to decide whether or not cases were suitable for ladies. They might be shocked or somehow polluted by anything to do with what was called sex filth or other nefariousness. The SDRA did prompt action in some quarters. The Inns of Court immediately admitted women, as we know, and Oxford decided to award its female students degrees for the first time, though Cambridge infamously resisted until 1948. Despite the Act, however, this was in many ways the worst time for women like Gwyneth to think of entering the professions. Though they had won temporary respect and valuable experience by metaphorically donning bowler hats and pinstripes during the First World War, priority was now being given to returning servicemen, while their wives and daughters, sisters and mothers were expected to unfold their pinnies and retreat to the parlour. That's when teaching hospitals began refusing to admit women again. This was one of the very few that did after the war, tantalisingly having allowed them in for a while. And professional firms declined to employ those who had fought so hard to complete their years of training. It must have been heartbreaking. The economic climate of the mid-1920s hit everyone hard. Educated women felt guilty for occupying positions which in the good old days, before the war, belonged exclusively to men. It took moral courage for male employers and female employees to stand up for the rights of a woman architect or civil engineer, for example, a solicitor, university lecturer, or a family doctor. This made their successes all the more extraordinary. It's a myth that either of the world wars liberated women in the long term. Expediency meant that they were given the taste of an independent career, but socio-economic pressures ensured that in peacetime the old order was reluctant to change. Gwyneth found that. Lip service was paid in the form of the SDRA, but the professional world was still sclerotic, hidebound by precedent and defensive, and quite frankly, scared of competition. After the passing of the SDRA, the implication was that now there were no barriers left for women. Admittedly, only those aged 30 or above could currently vote, but optimists like Gwyneth were sure that that would change soon. Besides, having a vote was all very well. As one suffrage campaigner said, it's what it led to that mattered. And yes, it was going to take a while for reactionary men to get used to working with women at the highest level, but that, too, must surely only be a matter of time. To some extent, it's still a matter of time. Received wisdom would have it that once the lumbering doors of the professional workplace creaked open after the SDRA, With a rush of fresh air and light, all women had to do was trot inside and get busy. This is not true. Watching each other's backs and with a shared determination to achieve independence and to live life on their own terms, their path was repeatedly obstructed, diverted, blocked. But they persevered, beginning a process we have yet to finish, opening a dialogue about work-life balance, which we have yet to resolve, and sacrificing so much we now take for granted. We owe Gwyneth and her peers more than we can know.
Thank you both very much for very, very stimulating speeches. Thank you. There should be plenty of time for questions from the floor, but I do have a number of questions here, which I've actually gathered from various sources, including from law undergraduates. The first one, though, actually relates to Gwyneth herself. She, of course, is the absolute inspiration for our event here today. And her story as a professional woman, albeit that it had a tragic end, but her story as a professional had many modern resonances. And I would like to know, the questioner wishes to know, what is the single most important lesson for aspiring lawyers to be derived from Gwyneth's own professional experience? I'm going to ask our two speakers first, because they've been the ones who've actually been explaining all the details of Gwyneth's life, but then I will open it to the panel. Taking it in order, Senia, what would you like to comment on that?
I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to give legal advice. I am a professional woman. Can I say two things? Two really important things, I think, and I think increasingly as I get older. One is to try very hard and to try from the beginning of career and, in fact, in university and earlier, to not take things personally, because it generally isn't about you. It's about somebody who's inadequate, giving you a hard time because you are better than them. And that's very hard. I think we all find that difficult, but I think it's important. The other thing that I think is absolutely essential is to make sure that wherever you are, and whatever profession you're in, that you find like-minded people who get it. So that no matter how grim things are, there's always someone there that you can say, you would not believe what X just said, and I'll say, oh yeah, rather than you must have said something wrong or done something wrong. So that would be my two pieces of advice. Don't take it personally, and make sure you've got a good posse of friends.
Jane.
Yeah, are these working? No, maybe you can hear me anyway, can you? Yeah. My public. I would certainly agree with Senia and say that I think what helped get Gwyneth and the other pioneers through was a sense of sisterhood. And I don't mean that in a militant sense at all, but just the fact that you are sharing this experience together and you are representing many, many, many more women who can't be in the position that you're in. So I think that sense of sisterhood is mutual support, I guess, is what it signals, and that's really, really important. And also, I think even now, sometimes you have to just suspend disbelief in order to get on with things. I mean, that reading from the Evening Standard of 1913 is unbelievable, but there are things that are going on now that are unbelievable. And sometimes, for the greater good, you just have to clam up and try and just carry on calmly with what you're doing.
Thank you. I think I'll go to Sheila. Sheila, could I ask you to comment on that?
Is this working? I don't know.
Yes.
It is. Yes, I think it's absolutely right. You've got to strive. And I think you've also got to recognise that you cannot achieve your objective necessarily of having a successful career alone. In other words, you do have to have some support. Now, men are under a great deal of criticism for not being sympathetic. When I started at the bar, well, first of all, when I came here, there were 10 women and about 300 men, 10 of us in the whole of Oxford in 1953. And then when I went on to be called to the bar, I was very much in the minority, and there was huge antagonism to women practicing at the bar. Now, it was not just from the established barristers who had never experienced it before. There's an awful lot. We've never had it before. We don't know what it's like. We don't know whether we like it or not. And that has affected, I think, women going into every profession. And if I had not had a break and been offered by the man who was the head of chambers a chance to practice in chambers, I would never have gone anywhere. And the same applied when I went into the specialty of ecclesiastical law. If there hadn't been brave men who were prepared to give me a break, I wouldn't have achieved anything there either. So I do think that it's important that we're not just waving flags for women, we are asking women to be grateful for the support that they get from men and to encourage men to be more supportive of women. That is a way through to get the whole thing moving much more rapidly, I think. And it can't be done, I don't think, stridently by marching up and down and holding flags. It's got to be done by example. That's my personal view and my personal experience.
Thank you. Janet, on aspiring lessons, aspirational lessons.
Well, I think I should start by saying I too married a lawyer, dear friends, just like Gwyneth Bebb, and it was a very good move that I did that. And it goes to this point of having support, some sort of support mechanism. My husband was wonderfully understanding, and he certainly made the difference, even to the point when I made partnership before he did. And I remember coming home and saying, "Oh, they've offered me a partnership." And he said, "Take it, we need the money." And I thought, right. I thought, that's the right attitude. The second thing that struck me was the references in both descriptions to her sense of humour. Yes. And I do think having a sense of humour is absolutely vital, because you will come across situations which, well, quite frankly, in retrospect, are now funny. At the time, you don't realise what's happening to you. And I will give you one very quick example. Forgive me if those of you who've heard this story before. I applied for articles in 1969, very well-known city law firm, still in existence today. And I received a letter which said, "Dear Miss Craddock," as I then was, "we shall not be calling you for interview. We are prejudiced against female article clerks due to some unfortunate experiences in the past." Now, I look at that letter now and I laugh. That was 6 years before the Sex Discrimination Act. But at the time, it was pretty awful. But sense of humour will get you through.
We might come back to interesting or amusing experiences in professional careers. But Carolyn, aspirational lessons.
I think what I would encourage everybody to do is identify an ambition and pursue it. But tell people what it is, because otherwise people will assume that you want to go into something traditional. I mean, everyone was always trying to push me into family law, which is, you know, a perfectly honourable area of work to work in. But it was something in which I had no interest. I wanted to be in the sort of commercial sphere. And, you know, women don't do that. So if you don't tell people what you want to do, you will get sidelined into things that you don't want to do, and you don't accept that, because the work is going to be hard, and it'll be just as hard, or even harder, if it's something you don't enjoy. If it's something you do enjoy, then. And the other thing I would say is never be afraid to be the first person to do something, because somebody has to be the first person to do something, and every time you do it, it breaks the mould. And, you know, I mean, Christina is now the fifth woman president of the Law Society in, 15, 16 years. So, you know, if one person does it, then it happens for other people. I had a bit of a spell, which I might come back to perhaps in later on today, but I had a spell as chairman of governors at Cheltenham Ladies' College, and there had never been a female chair of governors at Cheltenham Ladies College. That is quite bizarre, I think. The principal had always been a woman, but the chair of governors had always been a man. You know, a woman can do the job provided she's overseen by a man. Well, that's okay then. But now they're on the third chair who's a woman, so every chair since me has been a woman. So, you know, you have to do it in order for people to say, oh, okay, it's probably all right. The world won't come to an end.
Nikki, from your experience as a solicitor rather than necessarily a politician, aspirational lessons.
I think, really picking up, the word that both Senya and Jane used was brave, and describing Gwyneth Bebb. And so I think the single lesson probably, I think it does pick up what Carolyn has just said, is to be brave. And there will be times when you're asked to do something that you don't know what to do or how to do it. And it would be so easy to say, oh, I don't think I'm ready, or I don't think it's for me. But actually just saying yes and then wondering. I'm sure the whole panel will have experiences, and people in the audience, of times you've taken something on, you thought, I have no idea how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to find somebody who's going to help me. And that's secret. The other thing is perseverance, which again I think the panel of just keep going. Gwyneth Bebb never. I think Senya, you captured it was a long campaign, you said, and it she kept going with others, but that keeping going is really, really important.
English.
Well, I would absolutely endorse what's just been said by everyone on the panel. On a personal basis, I think also the courage, but also a sense of humour. And I also adopted Anne of Green Gables' naivety, that it almost had a presumption that everyone would be good, of goodwill, despite the fact that we're patently not. So when I was made Solicitor General, I discovered that I couldn't use the changing rooms at the Faculty of Advocates in Scotland because there had never been a woman law officer in the past, and therefore I was confined to the public toilets to change for the first appeal I was to argue. So of course immediately I just reverted to, if Superman can do it in the telephone box, I can do it in the toilet. And I think you had to have that element, and also the ability to have that humour when there were naysayers. So someone would congratulate me on being appointed as Lord Advocate and say, this is just wonderful, but what on earth will you do afterwards? Well, here I am, so it doesn't turn out too bad, I think.
We do have a number of very serious questions, but just touching on a number of things that our panellists have said in terms of incidents that have happened to them. One of the questions here is, would you like to explain more to us about incidents that have happened to you which are good, amusing, or downright awful? And we've certainly heard something from Janet there. We've had, as I mentioned earlier, Sheila's earlier career was posed quite a few difficulties to her. So let me just, I'll ask Carolyn next. Something good, amusing, or downright bloody awful?
I think my interview for articles was quite interesting in that I was interviewed by the senior partner. This was a modest-sized firm in Swansea, where I'm still live, and the senior partner interviewed me, and of course there'd never been, well, again at first, there'd never been a woman article clerk in that firm, so, this man was a middle-aged bachelor who probably couldn't quite believe that, no woman will ever have a legal brain, the quote that we heard. And I was halfway through the solicitors' finals at the time, and the process then was that you did them sequentially, did the subjects sequentially. So if you were halfway through, there were 3 subjects you hadn't done yet. But that didn't stop him asking me in detail about the substance of all 6 of the subjects. Now this took a couple of hours, as you can imagine. He then put me in a room on my own with a blank sheet of paper and a moneylenders agreement, and asked me to redraft it in accordance with the Consumer Credit Act, which actually I would challenge most people to do now or at any other time. And I wrote what I knew about the Consumer Credit Act on the piece of paper and left in tears, vowing never to go back. I did actually do articles with that firm. And when I started, I discovered that I was being paid very, very significantly less than the 2 men who had started on the same day. And when I discovered this and challenged them on it, it was, oh well, they've got wives to support. You live with your parents. Okay, that's all right, is it? And I'm afraid that imbalance had a rather sad and ironic end in that 25 years later, of the three of us who started on the same day, one had very sadly died, the other had been struck off, and I was president of the Law Society.
Nikki, how bad amusing?
Well, I think so. Good is the fact that I think Sheila mentioned people as champions, men and women. So the wonderful Anne Smart, who was here, who was a professor here, gave me my break to come to St Hugh's because my story is that I didn't have a place and I got better A-level results than expected, and called her up and badgered her, and she found a place for me because somebody had dropped out the year above, and because it was a college system, able to be more flexible, and here I am, and it completely transformed, I think, my prospects being at this college. And when I became Education Secretary, again, completely unexpected position, the Prime Minister, asking me to do it and give me no time, critical this, no time to think about it whatsoever. He said, I'm about to tweet it out, so the answer is yes. And that was it, really. So the bad was, I am the first woman to chair the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee, and as some of you will know, we've been doing a lot about what the banks have been up to and the way they treated customers. And so in the course of the last 12 months, I had called to meet a chap who had been caught up in this, and a fellow MP had asked me to meet him. And he was sort of skirting around the issue a bit. And I said, could you just explain exactly what is the issue with the products that you were sold by the bank? And he looked at me and said, well, he said, yes, it's quite complicated. He said, but Oliver did say you're quite bright, so I'll give it a go. Now, I thought, okay, now 10 years ago, I'd have just sort of laughed it off and everything. I just looked straight at him and went, gosh, that's really patronising, isn't it? And the other young man who was from the committee, I thought wanted the ground to swallow him up. And this man, he couldn't believe it. He was stuttering, and I'm so sorry, and I didn't mean to do it, and all the rest of it. And I thought, right, go. That's what those of us who have been through these things, those of us who can do it, those of us who are older, absolutely need to challenge so that nobody else, I don't think he will ever make that mistake with a woman ever again.
I'll just pick up 2 points there. Very interesting that Nick has just made that point about reacting, because as I've gone through life, that's what I've become more determined to do. I will actually say, if I find treatment unfavourable, even though that doesn't necessarily go down very well, but you start off by being polite, feminine, and not really wanting to cause a fuss, but you actually have to do that on occasions. But I'll just pick up something that Carolyn said. When I moved to the northeast with my husband and daughter, as a young but not terribly young solicitor, I actually couldn't get a job for quite some time, even though I had a good portable skill, city-type training, a very good background, very good academic background from St Hugh's. I was told 2 things. One is that I couldn't possibly be serious because I had a small child. My small child is sitting over there at the end of the 3rd row with a smaller child, my granddaughter. I was also told that I would be taking up a job which a man should have in order to support his family. Now, neither Carolyn nor I are antique, I think. So this sort of attitude is actually quite prevalent in modern professional times. And I'll also endorse the point about only being paid part of what a male solicitor would actually have been paid at the time. And I'm not saying, I'm not offending the North East, because I actually love living in the North East, but that was an attitude I genuinely met. Okay, we have a serious question now. Are we ready? If one visualised in 2018 a graph of the trajectory of women in the legal professions since the SDRA, 1990, thank you, Jane, at which point, in your opinion, does the graph reach? So the graph of the trajectory of women in the legal professions since the 1990 Act. Does your answer differ? You get points for all this. Does your answer differ if one considers entry to the professions or presence in positions of seniority? And Ailish, over to you.
Well, gosh, that's a hard question. 2 parts, and I have the concentration span of a fruit fly, so I'll do my very best. So far as the trajectory is concerned, I'd say that if it is probably disappointing. However, I think in the last 15 years or so, if we're looking at the entry, then it's looking much more positive. Indeed, I understand in many law schools across the country that the number of women coming into law schools are in fact exceeding males. Indeed, and that's part of the picture of education at school as well in terms of success. So therefore, I think that we have this burgeoning number of women in the early years in our profession, and less so at the top. But we have had some very significant, and I think that's important, very significant and symbolic gains. Certainly with Brenda Hale as the President of the Supreme Court. We have indeed Heather Hallett from St Hugh, again another very, very senior law judge, and many senior partners. Dorothy Livingston here again was the first partner again in a major commercial firm. In fact, she's provided a photograph of a postcard which you must see in the way out of her at a celebration of the firm when she was only woman with her 69 male partners. So and that's now becoming more. We're seeing many more partners. So I think that certainly that there are so many significant female appointments in law, which gives great cause for optimism, but it's certainly not there yet. And certainly, that I would still say that whenever I go to a law dinner, there is still an overwhelmingly male feel about the environment and the atmosphere. Perhaps not in commercial law settings, but more so when you visit the inns, I think.
I'm going to ask Janet in terms of issues like women partners in firms. We do, certainly we know, have a considerable number of women entrants to the profession, but the reaching the level of partner, indeed senior partner, as you did, there's an enormous sort of tail off, and it is said to be common that the point at which women have children and need to take time off is the time that women decide they won't consider partnership or won't consider actually leave the bar as well. So, Janet, partnerships?
I think there are many reasons why the profession still faces this challenge about making the most of its female talent. I mean, there's no doubt about it that women are not hanging around to become leaders, if I can put it that way. One of the reasons, I think, is the working environment in many law firms. I was reflecting, actually, with Dorothy before this session, that in some ways, when we qualified, it was easier than it is now for women to practice what is an almost unsustainable lifestyle, particularly if you have children, but not necessarily because you have children. Because you are balancing all sorts of other things as well, including you may be married and so on and so forth. Your husband may want to move around the world. All sorts of things can get in the way. I also think that women can often be silent sufferers. They will leave a firm without actually saying why they're leaving. And that knowledge, which is so important, never gets fed into the thought processes of the firm itself. And it goes to this point about women asking for promotion. One of the things that was very striking when I was Commissioner for Public Appointments was how I had to keep saying to women in particular, apply. You need to apply. And I have to say, I am the perfect example of this. This story is almost unbelievable now when I think about it. The predecessor as senior partner in Simmons & Simmons walked into my office one day and said, "Janet, have you ever thought about being senior partner?" And I laughed. I said, "No, you must be joking." And when the election for senior partner happened, he walked back into my office, he pushed me aside from my computer, he tapped into the computer, "I wish to stand for election as senior partner." He pushed my chair back and he said, "Press send." And That's how I became senior partner. And I'm afraid I was exhibiting absolutely the worst female trait. And he said to me afterwards, and I've never forgotten it, he said, "Janet, you know, women have to be asked to dance."
Yes.
And I've often thought about it. So we've got a lot to learn.
Thank you. I do have a lot more questions here, but I'm very conscious that there are probably lots and lots of questions in the audience. So, can we have hands up, please, for some stimulating questions? Right. John Hayes, former Secretary General of the Law Society. I think there's a mic coming down to you, John.
Well, I've got a question, but it's a comment, first of all, based on three things. Firstly, I am the father-in-law of a woman lawyer. She was articled in a city firm, worked in a city firm, and she's also from an ethnic minority. And I blame myself, I've never asked her this question before. She's now left the profession, and I asked her knowing I was coming. She said the worst thing is the lack of a good role model inside a firm. Somebody you could talk to. Some vivid example of where you could reach to. The second thing she said was, there are still quite a lot of women within firms who, in their words, said, did it the hard way, and are immensely unsympathetic to women making their way up. I actually did find that myself in practice. The second thing I'd say is, as an employer of solicitors in 2 or 3 county councils, the quality of female applicants far exceeded the men, both in academic ability, enthusiasm and empathy. And you'd be an absolute fool not to take them on, and secondly, not to accommodate the needs that they might have in relation to balancing family life. It's not an altruistic, you don't need to be altruistic, you just have to be plain stupid to ignore that. You get far better value. Indeed, the real worry for women is because they suffer from a guilt complex about these accommodations, they will put far more into that than they should have to. One of my friends, the person who was the top of the year in my law school, she went part-time after having 2 children. In the end, one of her fellow partners said, "Angela, you've got to go back to being full-time. You are currently being paid less than any of the secretaries." So there has to be some stimulus inside the organisation. And I wonder whether those who in practice now here have examples of how women are encouraged to feel that they're not alone in progressing their careers and having somebody to look to.
That's really interesting. Is there somebody in the audience who wants to comment on that before I ask the panellists? Dorothy.
Yeah, perfect.
Dorothy Livingston. Right, all those points you make that resonates very strongly with me. I think the role of senior women to mentor and encourage women to climb up what seems to be a longer professional route to senior roles, certainly in the solicitor's profession, is desperately important. And being prepared to talk to people, to help them, to listen to their concerns and try to see how they might be addressed is very important. And also the advocacy of those women within the organisation for methodologies which make it easier for people to carry a heavy workload while enjoying a reasonable balance of family life. And that is one of the most important things you can do as a senior woman in an organisation. Sheila, your earlier career at the bar was self-evidently very difficult. In terms of the comments that people are making about what you need, a female role model, mentoring help, is it only about self-determination, or do any of those things chime with you?
Well, not really. I mean, I have to put in a plug for the bar. The great advantage of being a barrister is that you're self-employed, so you're not indebted to partners and you don't have targets that you have to meet, and you don't have to charge so much per hour for your work, although it has crept in a bit at the bar. It's very much an individualist thing, and it doesn't suit everybody. But I've spent over 40 years at it, and I don't regret one day of it. And of course others, contemporaries of mine, I mean, I've been retired now for 17 years. I'm an antique, put out to grass. But, I mean, they were fantastic years. I did have to fight very hard. And I just tell you, the one amusing thing, when I started in a very small way by going to magistrates' court and representing people who'd, driven over traffic lights at red, and also I did quite a lot of matrimonial work. And I remember going one day, I was given very little what you called instructions, because although I had a solicitor, he just sort of said that Mrs. Smith needs representation at West Ham Magistrates' Court. So I'd trundle along, and then I'd call out Mrs. Smith, and about 3 people would put their hands up. And I would say, oh, Mrs. Mary Smith or Joan Smith or whatever. And this woman would come forward, and I said, well, I just want to go through 1 or 2 points with you. And we sit there for about a quarter of an hour. And this particular woman, on this particular day, said to me, I don't know why I'm telling you all this. I'm waiting for my barrister.
Actually, let me just say, one of the questions I had here was, would you agree with the comment of 2 well-known QCs in 2016, I better not say who they are, that overt sexism and unacceptable behaviour is on the wane, that a number of male lawyers do not understand diversity, and the barriers facing women lawyers are higher because of their more complex life roles? So that was one of the questions, and I think that chimes very well. We can come on to that in a minute, but I see Christina Blackwell's has got a question there. Current President of the Law Society.
Hello, thank you very much. So at the Law Society, recognising that women in leadership in law is a particular problem, as you rightly say, about 2/3 of the entrants into our profession have been, for the last 30 years, have been female. And yet if you look at our big law firms, under 15% are owned by women. So what we've done a big survey, and it ended up being a global survey, and it ended up being the largest has ever been undertaken. And the one thing that came out as being the key issue for why women are not progressing in their careers was unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. So just wanted to ask the panel about that.
Well, I think actually that ties in really, really well with the question or the comments from the 2 well-known QCs. So we can spend a long time now speculating about who they actually are.
I'll tell you later.
All right, okay. Overt sexism and unacceptable behaviour is on the wane. Which I think is right in the sense that it's I doubt very much that it's not that it wouldn't happen or doesn't happen, but I doubt very much people will get overt discrimination to their face. You can't do that case because you're a woman. Or we're not going to give you that promotion because you're a woman. But this issue of unconscious bias, which a colleague described as basically another word for discrimination, is very much on the rise. And the Select Committee just did an inquiry on women in finance, so obviously women who work alongside often law firms and in financial institutions. And absolutely, the issue, I think we all do it in different ways. We make assumptions about people. So when there's perhaps a foreign posting, we won't put so-and-so forward because they've got small children. Or, when there is a difficult piece of work, a case that's going to go on for months and months, we're not going to ask them to do it because actually we think that's something that they'd say no to. So we count people out, often women, before we've even asked them the question. And so I think a lot of firms, going back to John's point, which is what are firms doing, a lot of firms and a lot of organisations generally are trying to do this unconscious bias training, some of it more successful than others, lots of women's networking type organisations as well. But I think it is good for all of us to actually be asked to think about the assumptions that we make about the people that we work with and the people that we come into contact with, to challenge ourselves about whether we are counting people out, assuming people will say yes or no, usually no, before we have even actually got round to asking. So I do think that's the next big barrier to overcome. But it's a question of changing cultures. As you all know, changing culture in an organisation is a really difficult thing to do.
Carolyn, are quotas the answer?
Personally, I don't think so. I think quotas, for me, my personal opinion is that quotas undermine everybody who is then appointed to anything, because everyone assumes that they're only appointed because they're a woman or because they're from an ethnic minority, or whatever the quota is. Personally, I don't support that. Targets, perhaps, so that, you know, I think the point I want to make on this is that I do believe it's still the case that women need to prove themselves better than the rest of the men to get appointed, whereas a man starts at a position where there are certain assumptions made about skills and talents and experience, whereas a woman still has to prove that she's better. And there's an absolutely wonderful quote from Mary Archie, which I think is out in the public, which is that she said that she wouldn't rest until there were as many mediocre women at the top as there are mediocre men. And I think that's what we need to aim for. So that, you know, there is, just that, you know, there is an assumption that you know that women will be as good as men. That's where we need to aim.
More question.
Can I just add to that, Veronica?
Oh,
I mean, I'd like to tell you lots of stories about sexist Oxford. I could give you all sorts of anecdotes, and Cambridge for that matter, but I won't now, maybe later. But I think, obviously I'm not a lawyer, but many of these issues are absolutely the same for us. The professoriate here is 18% female, which is appalling by any standards. The number of women, even in women's colleges, who are fellows is low and falling, which is appalling as well. And it seems to me that one of the things that we are acknowledging more here in Oxford, and perhaps the law is acknowledging as well, is that these are structural, as well as I think you're absolutely right about unconscious bias. But if you are educated in a university like this one, and almost everyone who teaches you is a man, almost everything you read is written by a man, almost every portrait on every wall, including the one where you take your exams, is a man, that will have an impact. The evidence on this is absolutely clear, and that's structural. And the other thing that we're looking at more and more, and I wonder if it's the same in the law, is the issue of, which a lot of people have alluded to here, about women having to put themselves forward and women being their own worst enemies and not doing what they perhaps are capable of. And I completely agree with what's been said about senior role models. I had no women role models whatsoever. But it seems to me that that's work. And what we're doing here is asking women who are already underrepresented to do more work by mentoring. And I think we need to recognise as a profession that that is work, and it should be counted when we go for promotions and pay rises and so on, because it's good for us and it's good for the profession. And perhaps we need to think about this business of women not putting themselves forward. I mean, I would think of this as a historian, but in the 20th century, women voted with their feet. They left domestic service to go into factories because it was better for them to go into factories. They did all sorts of things. And women vote with their feet when they go for jobs. They're not silly. One of the reasons that women don't perhaps apply for positions that they are actually capable of is because they know that it's not worth it, or they won't get it. So perhaps the structures within the organisations have to change. And yes, we do have to encourage, women have to encourage men to be more accommodating, but I think men have to encourage men to be more accommodating as well, because women can't do all the work.
Professor Getsley, you had a question.
I wanted to thank Nikki Morgan for mentioning Anne Smart, who was my colleague when I arrived at St Hugh's and was a fierce promoter of female lawyers. Yeah. And she should be remembered and respected and honoured for that role. I'm intrigued by the role of the law in the Bebb story. And it's interesting that a profession in this country, in many countries, tends to be a private club. It's outside the state. We don't even believe in the state, in England particularly. And earlier jurisprudence held that the law had no look-in to decide who could join clubs like the bar or the solicitor's profession. And so the Bebb case is interesting that the lawyers just assumed that it was justiciable, which is quite interesting. It's also interesting that the very posh Tory politician Robert Cecil argued the case and comes across as a kind of very powerful feminist. He also helped found the League of Nations. He believed in extending law to many new areas of life. And I'm reflecting on Senia's speech about the famous Dangerfield thesis, The Strange Death of Liberal England, and the idea that England was having a nervous breakdown before the First World War and was seeking violence and destruction and pulling down its own institutions, a bit like today. And that's a pretty sombre note, that we've hit Bebb into a general sense of a stupid, mediocre elite putting their feet into the ground and refusing to listen to the changes around them and helping to provoke crisis. There are many resonances. But I also noticed that there's another famous persons case led by the distinguished Labour Lord Chancellor Viscount Sankey, Edwards against Canada, 1929, where the Bebb case is put down very firmly, which holds that in the British Commonwealth, in the wider common law world, women are persons, obviously, across the gamut of politics, law, family life, contract, property. This is only 15 years later. So it's very interesting that a reverse and something bad that happens can be such a provocation. It can lead to a strike back, and you get this great revival of liberalism, or a sense of a generous adding power and capacities to all people that follows in its wake. So I'd be quite curious to know who's written about the Bebb case and tried to fit it into this whole danger-filled hypothesis. And I want to thank the panel for a very stimulating presentation of the Bebb story.
Thank you. I've no doubt there will be a book or two in this. It's not simply that the times need to be talked about, but again, we come back to the idea that Gwyneth, or the brilliant Miss Bebb, as she was referred to by male colleagues, she deserves to be remembered much more than she has been. But certainly I can see that there may be a book or two here, not written by me, but I'm sure will be. I'm very conscious that we're almost at 4 o'clock. We could, I think, go on for a long time. There are many questions which could be put. I don't want to inconvenience anybody who needs to leave at 4. Maybe another event that people need to go to. But I'm very happy to ask more questions if more questions are there to be put and answered. But if anybody really does need to leave at 4 because you're going somewhere else, that's quite understandable. John Dennis Smith.
I'll just speak. My question is there any legislative, we have a legislator here, for all the panel, is there any legislative change, or one legislative change, would you suggest should be made to improve the issues about which you talk?
50-50 Parliament is what I do straight away. 50-50 Parliament.
I actually can't think of any. I do sometimes think culture and environment and structure are very important, and legislation obviously can be the real catalyst of social change. But in the Scottish Parliament, we didn't have that. We have a very, very significant proportion of women, and a women First Minister, but throughout as well. And so Scotland's not known for its huge feminism in the past, or attitudes, but there has been a real sea change in attitudes in Scotland. And I think that so much about is what we do as individuals, our own lives, our own examples, and how we treat our daughters, our sons, etc., and how the self-confidence we give them. And I do see still here in Oxford, for instance, an example about actually very, very many bright women who are achieving high 2-1s but not getting first class. And we agonise over why in Oxford it's not exhibited in other universities necessarily, but there is something very worrying there about self-confidence and self-belief when it gets to that age. And I think that is something which we can't legislate for in a sense, because it's what we have done about self-belief and what we are doing about self-belief and confidence, and the way in which we perhaps as women do treat people differently. So I still think it's about us as just rather than I can't think at the moment of not being very creative about a single piece of legislation that might change that.
Nikki, are you able to answer that as a politician?
Yes, without bringing sort of politics into it. I mean, I think I agree with Senia about 50-50 Parliament. But I think, obviously we're talking today very much about a leading woman and women who have changed things. We do need to be conscious of the fact that diversity is more than just about gender, actually. And so the issue, 50-50 Parliament is But it would be great to have more women, absolutely, but we need more people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different sexualities as well, to really challenge the groupthink that Joshua was talking about the elite. And Carolyn whispered to me, she said, don't get involved in what he's saying about the resonances between now and 1908 or whatever, so I won't. But the thing that I think that the legislation which we are tracking, which I was privileged to be involved in, was the gender pay gap regulations. Because that has got employers of over, at the moment, over 250 employees. I think the government will go further, but it is changing. The transparency is a really good thing, and it is changing the way employers have to report. That they didn't have to report at all before, now they do, on the gender pay gap. And what's been really striking are the number of senior executives who have come to me and said, well, it's extraordinary. We have more women at the bottom of our organisations in less qualified roles than we have at the top. I say, well, there's a thing. Now we know why the gap's there. What are you going to do about it? So it's the next challenge. And I think we'll extend it. So, and of course, it may well be, it's not just down to gender pay gap. There may be other pay gaps for other reasons, which I suspect we will end up, if we can change the culture without legislating, I think that's a good thing. But if we need to push it, I think that governments of all hues will be interested in passing further laws on that.
Colleagues, any comment on possible legislative change? Janet?
General observation, really. I think history, I'm now speaking as an employment lawyer, very much a perception from that end of things. It's quite clear that relying on people to do things voluntarily only gets you so far. It's when a statute comes in that you start to see some sort of change. So there's no question that legislation is a huge help. Having said that, I actually think that there is a huge amount to be done in relation to, I talked about working environment, the way the contract for employment is used these days. It's very old-fashioned. It's not dealing with the modern workplace. Now, that's nothing to do with legislation. That's to do with people running organisations and realising they're not using their human resources in the most efficient way. But that takes a lot of courage, and it's very, very difficult to change. But that's changing things really at the coalface. And legislation won't do that. It may create the context to do it, but it's got to be done by the people running these organisations.
Can I just...
Oh, it's all right.
I was just going to add to...
Thank you ever so much. It's been a wonderful afternoon and a lovely exhibition. And could I say, because I read the comments on there, this is just a comment from somebody who read English, I wish you'd get rid of the idea that the only woman lawyer in the whole world of literature was Portia.
I like that very much. That, I think, is down to our wonderful archivist Amanda Ingram and librarian Nora Cady, who've done the captions for the exhibition, and they actually found that wonderful quote. So I will allow them to take responsibility for that. Sheila, you
Yes, I just wanted to follow up the last point about contracts of employment. I mean, I think legislation has improved things tremendously for women with maternity pay and now paternity pay, because it's made a great difference to couples when a child arrives. That was legislation. I have a slight concern, and I don't know how widespread this is, but I've had over the years reports about going back to work after your maternity leave. I don't know about paternity leave, but maternity leave. And that employers sort of say, well, the job isn't open anymore, and they're obliged actually to keep the job open. We say, we've reorganised during your absence. And, I mean, this happened to a member of our family, 2 members of our family, actually, and they both, fortunately, stood up to themselves, because I said, just tell them it's against the law and they've got to find the job. And miraculously, it was refound or reorganised. But if girls are not prepared to stand up for their rights, they can still be overridden by unsympathetic employers. And I just think that that's an area that needs to be watched in case more legislation is required, that it is, illegal I mean, I think it is already illegal not to keep the job open, but whether there needs to be more enforcement of that, I don't know, remains to be seen. But may I just make a general point as we're winding up, that I think what's been said by the other panellists about the increase in number of young women going into the law is very encouraging, but it does take time, whether you're a solicitor or a barrister, and in either profession you can apply for appointments now. You have to apply, but it takes time for them to feel ready to apply for an appointment. And I just looked at some of the 2017 figures, and in the courts there are 890 women out of 3,134 men. That's judges. And for tribunals, of which we have many now, dealing with social security, immigration, and goodness knows what, it's nearly half. 806 of 1786 tribunal judges are women. So we're nearly there in certain respect, but it's going to take a little more time. But that does mean that women are applying, they are being approved for the appointments, and the door is open.
Certainly, speaking as a tribunal judge myself for 17 years, there are plenty more women around in the tribunal jurisdiction than I was in immigration and asylum, and also social entitlement. There are many more women around there than you might find in other branches of the judiciary. Any more questions from the floor?
No. Just coming clear.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, as will be obvious from my question. I'm not a lawyer. I was looking in an old copy of New Scientist. I think it was from my student days, and in the back there were some advertisements of various posts, and this is from the 60s, and it said things like, botanist required at Kew Gardens, salary men, women, men such and such, women such and such, which was lower. Several of these advertisements, and there were other advertisements which said something like enthusiastic man required by engineering company, etc. But some of them said equal pay after. Now, I imagine that was the Sex Discrimination Act. Was that 1966 or something? And I was just wondering what that actually said. Was that to do with equal pay, presumably, or not discriminating against people applying? So that's my first question. Second question, were there any significant bits of legislation between the 1919 Act we've been discussing, 1919?
Yeah.
We've been discussing. Yes. And say the 1966 Act, if I'm correct about that date, that any significant bits of legislation that actually made a difference?
Janet, it's definitely a question for you.
This is actually quite confusing, this legislative time, because the Sex Discrimination Act was 1975, the Equal Pay Act was 1970, but it was part of the Sex Discrimination Act, which is all very confusing. But those two pieces of legislation were really the first to start making waves. I mean, before then, in the employment law arena, we had we used to have people, we used to learn about master and servant and learn cases about butlers being ejected from country houses. That's what it was like. We had Race Relations Act, we had Contracts for Employment Act, but the Sex Discrimination Act and the Equal Pay Act, those were the two pieces that really set the ball rolling. There wasn't really anything. There wasn't really anything.
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah, there wasn't really anything. And not focused on that completely, discrimination itself.
Veronica, can I just say something?
So it was Leary Constantine, the cricketer, who was refused entry to a hotel because it was an inn. An inn could not discriminate. That was old-fashioned common law.
Yeah.
But it illustrates that there was no general law about discrimination.
It was very late, actually, when you think about it. It was very late.
Yes. Just to go back to earlier stuff, though, it's remarkable to me how many pieces of legislation affecting women and children were passed between 1918, when women could first become MPs, and, say, 1928, when there was universal suffrage. There was a whole slew of legislation involving women and children. Things like the Bastardy Act, which was really significant, actually, about providing maintenance for illegitimate children, things like that. And then, of course, you get Eleanor Rathbone passing the Family Allowances Act. Somerville alumna, I must get that in. So there was significant legislation, just perhaps not to do with equal pay or the gender gap.
Thank you. I'm just going to call a pause here because there is a surprise coming up. And it is a surprise for Gwyneth Bebb's descendants and their partners.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's fantastic.
Can I just say that the memorial window to Gwyneth, which was at St Mary's, her school, was lost possibly in the Blitz. There is a photograph of it, which was very kindly supplied by Martin Tomlins, Gwyneth, Mrs Thompson's grandson, I should say. And the lady over there is my niece Amelia, who's a very talented artist. I actually thought that it would be a very good idea if Amelia could recreate the window as a gift to the family. The window was done by public subscription organised by Miss Litherby. And you have heard earlier that Gwyneth was at St Mary's for only 2 years, from 1906 to 1908. The letter calling for subscriptions refers to her rare charm and the effect that she had on those surrounding her at the school. And that, of course, is the charm and humour which has been referred to, but we also have in recordings of Gwyneth Bebb's letters, which have kindly been done by Catherine, the Alumni Relations Manager over there. People can hear them if they wish to. But we just thought that this would be a suitable gift because of the huge amount of memorabilia made available to us for the first time. It's not in the public domain. Made available to us for purposes of this event. A wonderful exhibition which I really urge people to look at. And just as a huge thank you. I don't actually know who or how is going to take it home with them. Whether you're going to pass it round.
Martin lives in Spain.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Real pleasure. Thank you. Real pleasure. Could I just thank everybody who's attended today? I know that we could go on for a very long time, but I'm conscious that many of you have events to go to. Thank you very much for the stimulating questions. I would also like to pay particular thanks to Amanda Ingram and Nora Kay. Amanda is the archivist and she's sitting at the back there. Nora Kay, the librarian, is sitting next to her. Please stand up, ladies. They've put a huge effort into organising the exhibition, so thank you very much for that. Could I also thank a couple of other people? This event wasn't organised by me alone. It wasn't organised with any great ease, I have to say, because there's so many component parts to it. And people have had a different task in actually bringing all this together. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Dr. Janetta Corley, who's going to stand up and make herself known. Please, Janetta, please. Janetta compiled the leaflet, which you will have seen. She's also done an enormous amount of research, including many days in the Women's Library, and I think we ought to purchase a camp bed for her, the amount of time she spent in the Women's Library. I'd also like to thank Ben Parker, who's sitting just behind her. Please, Ben, stand up. Ben is the immediate past president of St Hugh's Alumni Association, and effectively the three of us actually worked on this project together. The original idea was from Dr. Corley, but also Dr. Anne Souter, who can't be here today. And I walked into a conversation being held by Janetta and Anne about the radio play that some of you may have heard about the disappearance of Miss Bebb. And the cause célèbre, as far as the conversation was concerned, was there had been no mention of St Hugh's. And I walked into the conversation, and effectively we thought, we can do something about that. And this is what we've done about it. But huge thanks to my colleagues. Huge thanks also to the development of this, the development director Sarah Carthew, but also Catherine Rainsbury over there, the alumni relations manager, who has worked her socks off to make this successful event. And my illustrious colleagues here, will you all please take a bow? Thank you very much.
Metaphorical bow, yeah.
John and Sheila, thank you so much.
Well done to you.
We do have a little gift for you illustrious persons.
Can I just thank our wonderful Alumni Association, not just for this fabulous celebration. Of course, this whole year we've had many events on women's suffrage and the representation of the People Act, and Celia's exhibition in the Western Library is fabulous for you to go to. But throughout the year, and this does in fact suggest that we are a portrait short here in the college, so I think it's stimulated us to look at making sure we do have a portrait created, but we'll have to put that to our portrait committee, but I'm sure they will be very, very supportive of that. But can I just thank the Alumni Association for all of the events that they create throughout the year, and for being here, and for just being such a great bunch of people in their enthusiasm, and also to all of you. Haste you back to the college. Lovely to see you. Thank you.